The knock came soft at first, barely louder than the wind screaming across the Montana ridge. Then it came again, harder, desperate. 3 sharp raps that cut through the howl of the blizzard like gunfire. Colton Hayes set down his coffee and rose from the fire. He hadn't seen another soul in 2 weeks. The snow had shut down every road between his cabin and the nearest town. No one traveled the high country in February. No one with sense, anyway. He opened the door. A woman stood there, swaying on her feet, her coat crusted white with ice. Her lips were blue. Her eyes, wide and terrified, fixed on him with the last shred of consciousness she had left. "Please," she whispered. "I need." She collapsed into his arms. 3 days earlier, the stagecoach had rattled into Benton with its usual cargo: mail, dry goods, and 1 passenger who didn't belong. Nora Brennan stepped down onto the frozen mud wearing a traveling dress that would have been proper in St. Louis, but looked fragile as paper against the Montana cold. She was 29, a widow, and entirely alone. The driver tossed her trunk down without ceremony. "You sure someone's meeting you?" he asked. Nora pulled the letter from her coat and read it again, though she had memorized every word. "Mrs. Brennan, your services as housekeeper are required immediately. Lodging provided. Wages fair. Present yourself at the Ashford Ranch, 10 miles north of Benton. Signed, Samuel Ashford." "I'm expected," she said. The driver shrugged. "Storm's coming. You best not wait." She hired a wagon and a surly driver named Dutch who complained the entire way about the sky and the wind, and women who didn't know better than to travel in winter. The snow started an hour into the journey, light at first, then heavier. By the time they'd gone 6 miles, the world had disappeared into white. "Can't see the road," Dutch shouted over the wind. "We turn back now, or we die out here." "How much further to the ranch?" Nora called. "Don't know. Could be 4 miles. Could be 1. Can't tell in this." The wagon lurched sideways as the horses spooked. Dutch cursed and fought the reins. Then one of the wheels cracked against a hidden rock and splintered. The wagon tipped. Nora hit the snow hard, her breath knocked out of her. When she looked up, Dutch was already limping toward the horses, trying to calm them. "We're done," he shouted. "Wheels gone. We go on foot or we freeze." "Which way?" she asked. He pointed vaguely into the storm. "North. Maybe. Look for lights." Then he climbed onto one of the horses, left her trunk in the snow, and rode back the way they'd come without another word. Nora stood alone in the blizzard, snow already piling against her skirt. She grabbed what she could from the truck, a shawl, a small bag, and began to walk. She had no idea how long she stumbled through that white hell. Her hands went numb. Her legs stopped obeying her. The wind shoved her sideways, and she fell twice, each time harder to rise. Then, impossibly, she saw it. A light, faint and golden through the snow. A cabin. She staggered toward it, every step a battle. When she finally reached the door, she pounded on it with the last strength she had. The door opened. A man stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, firelight glowing behind him. His face was rough, weathered, his dark eyes sharp with surprise. "Please," she whispered. "I need." Then the world went black. Colton caught her before she hit the porch. He carried her inside, kicked the door shut against the storm, and laid her carefully on the rug near the fire. Her coat was frozen solid. He peeled it off gently, then wrapped her in every blanket he owned. Her pulse was faint but steady, her breathing shallow. He knelt beside her, rubbing warmth back into her hands. "Come on," he muttered. "Stay with me." Her eyes fluttered open. Blue, startling blue, even dulled by cold. "Where?" she began. "You're safe," he said. "Don't try to talk." She stared at him, confused, frightened. Then her gaze drifted past him to the cabin. Rough wooden walls. A single room, shelves lined with tools and tins. "This isn't the Ashford Ranch," she whispered. Colton frowned. "No, this is my claim. Ashford's place is 3 miles west." Her face crumpled. "I knocked on the wrong door." "You knocked on the only door that would have saved your life," he replied. "Storm like this, you wouldn't have made another mile." Tears slipped down her frozen cheeks. She turned her face away, ashamed. Colton stood and poured hot broth from the pot on the stove. He crouched beside her again and held the cup to her lips. "Drink." She obeyed, her hands still too numb to hold it herself. Outside, the blizzard raged on, sealing them inside together. And as the fire crackled and the wind howled, neither of them knew that the wrong door had just become the only right thing in both their broken lives. Morning came gray and muffled. The storm had not eased. Snow piled halfway up the cabin window, and the wind still howled like something living. Nora woke slowly, disoriented. She lay on a narrow cot near the fire, wrapped in heavy quilts. Across the room, the cowboy sat at a rough-hewn table, carving something from a piece of wood. He didn't look up when she stirred. She pushed herself upright, wincing. Every muscle ached. Her head felt thick. "How long did I sleep?" she asked. "Most of a day," Colton replied. "You needed it." She looked around the cabin properly now. One room, clean but sparse. A stove, a table, 2 chairs, shelves stocked with supplies. A rifle hung on the wall. Everything orderly, nothing wasted. "I should go," she said. "Mr. Ashford is expecting me." Colton finally looked at her. "You can't. Storm hasn't let up. Roads are buried. You'd be dead before you made 100 yards. Panic flickered across her face. "But he hired me. He'll think I'm unreliable. He'll think you're smart enough not to die in a blizzard." She twisted the edge of the quilt in her hands. "I can't afford to lose this position." Something in her voice made him pause. Desperation, carefully hidden. "Why'd you come all the way to Montana for housekeeping work?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer right away. "Finally," she said, "because no one in St. Louis would hire a woman whose husband drank himself to death and left her with nothing but debts." The words came out flat, like she'd said them too many times to feel them anymore. Colton set down his carving. "I'm sorry." She shook her head. "Don't be." "I'm not." He believed her. "You're welcome to stay until the storm breaks," he said. "I've got food enough for 2. I don't take charity." "Then work for your keep. Cook if you want. Mend if you want. Or sit by the fire and rest. I don't care which." She studied him carefully, searching for the catch. Men didn't offer kindness without wanting something. But his face was steady, unreadable. No hunger in his eyes. No hidden intent. "All right," she said softly. "Thank you." That afternoon, she insisted on helping. She swept the floor, organized his pantry, and made bread from his stores of flour and salt. The cabin filled with the smell of baking, warm and alive. Colton watched her move through his space, efficient and sure-handed. She worked the way someone did when work was all they had. At supper, they sat across from each other at the small table. The wind rattled the shutters. "You live up here alone?" she asked. 5 years now. No family. Not anymore." She understood that kind of answer. Some silences didn't need filling. "What do you do?" she asked. "Trap. Hunt. Cut timber when the season's right. Sell enough to get by. That's a hard life." "It's an honest one." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "Why'd you come out here?" He was quiet a long time. Then he said, "War took something from me. Figured if I came far enough, maybe I'd stop hearing it." She knew that, too. Running from ghosts. "Did it work?" she asked gently. "Some days." The firelight softened the hard lines of his face. He wasn't young, maybe 35, but he wasn't old either, just worn by weather and memory. "I'm Nora," she said. "Nora Brennan." Colton Hayes. They sat in silence after that, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that came when 2 people recognized the same scars. 3 days passed. The storm raged on, relentless. Nora and Colton fell into a careful rhythm. She cooked. He chopped wood and kept the fire alive. They spoke little, but the silence between them grew warmer. On the 4th night, she asked, "Do you ever get lonely?" Colton looked up from the book he'd been reading. "Used to. Don't notice it much anymore." "I noticed it every day in St. Louis," she said, "even when I was surrounded by people." He nodded slowly. "Loneliness ain't about being alone." "No," she agreed. "It's about not being seen." Their eyes met across the firelight. Something unspoken passed between them. The next morning, the wind finally died. Colton opened the door to a world buried in white. The snow had stopped, but the drifts were deep, the sky pale and still. "I can guide you to Ashford's place," he said. "Might take a few hours on foot, but it's passable now." Nora stood beside him, staring out at the frozen landscape. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt a strange ache in her chest. "All right," she said quietly. They set out after breakfast, moving slowly through snow that came up to their knees. Colton broke the trail. Nora followed in his footsteps. When they reached the ridge overlooking the valley, he pointed. "That's Ashford's place." She saw it below, A large ranch house, barns, fenced pastures. Smoke rose from the chimney. Colton started down the slope. Nora didn't move. Something wrong? He asked, turning back. She looked at the ranch, then at him. What if I don't go? He went still. What do you mean? What if I knocked on the wrong door for a reason? The words hung in the cold air between them. Colton climbed back up to where she stood. Nora, I know it sounds foolish, she said quickly. We barely know each other. But I felt more at home in your cabin these past days than I have anywhere in years. His expression shifted, surprise, hope, fear all at once. I can't offer you much, he said roughly. Just a hard life in the high country. I've had an easy life, she replied. It nearly killed me. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. And there, on a snow-covered ridge in the Montana wilderness, two lost souls made a choice that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with truth. They didn't go to the Ashford Ranch. Colton sent word to Samuel Ashford through a tracker passing south, explaining that Mrs. Brennan had been delayed by the storm and would not be taking the position. He enclosed the wages she would have earned for travel expenses, money he could barely spare. Nora tried to refuse. He wouldn't hear it. You came all this way on a promise, he said. Least I can do is make sure you're not at the cost. She looked at him with something close to wonder. Men in her old life had taken. This man gave. The first weeks were careful. They worked out the shape of their new arrangement like two people learning a complicated dance. Colton built a partition in the cabin to give her privacy. Nora sewed curtains from spare cloth and made the small space feel less like survival and more like home. They didn't speak of marriage right away. It hung between them, unspoken but understood. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Nora said, "People will talk. A woman living with a man unwed." "There are no people up here," Colton replied. "Just us." "Still," she said, "I've been talked about enough for one lifetime." He set down the trap he'd been mending. "Then we'll go to town when the thaw comes. Make it proper." She studied his face. "Is that what you want?" "I want you to stay," he said simply. "However that needs to happen." Her throat tightened. "I want to stay too." Spring came late to the high country, but when it arrived all at once. Snow melted into rushing creeks. Wildflowers burst through the wet earth. The world turned green and gold. They rode down to Benton on a clear April morning. The preacher married them in his small church with two witnesses pulled from the street. Nora wore a simple dress she'd made herself. Colton wore his cleanest shirt. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Colton kissed her gently, as if she were something precious he'd been trusted to protect. They rode back to the cabin as the sun set, painting the mountains pink and orange. That night, Nora stood on the porch and looked out at the vast Montana sky. Colton came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Knocking on the wrong door?" She leaned back against him. It wasn't the wrong door. It was the only one that mattered. Summer brought work. They cleared land, planted a garden, repaired the cabin roof. Nora's hands grew calloused. Her face tanned. She grew stronger, steadier. One afternoon, while hanging laundry, she felt a familiar flutter low in her belly. She pressed her hand there, hardly daring to believe it. That night, she told Colton. He sat very still for a long moment. Then he pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I thought I'd lost my chance at this," he whispered against her hair. "So did I," she said. Their daughter was born the following February, during another blizzard. Colton delivered her himself, his hands steady despite his fear. When the baby's cry filled the cabin, he bowed his head and wept. They named her Grace. Years passed. The cabin grew. Colton added 2 more rooms, built a proper barn, expanded his traplines. Nora started a small business selling preserves and baked goods to the miners who passed through in summer. Grace grew strong and wild, running through the high country like she owned it. 2 years later, a son arrived, Samuel, named for the man whose job offer Nora had never taken. One winter evening, when Grace was 5 and Sam was 3, the family sat around the fire. Snow fell softly outside. Grace demanded a story. Nora glanced at Colton. He smiled. "Once upon a time," Nora began, "a woman got very lost in a blizzard." Grace's eyes went wide. Was she scared? Terrified, Nora said. But she kept walking until she found a door. "Whose door?" Sam asked. "The right one," Colton said, pulling Nora close. Grace frowned. "But you said she was lost." "She was," Nora replied. But sometimes being lost is how you find where you're supposed to be. Later, after the children were asleep, Nora and Colton stood together on the porch. The stars burned cold and bright above the mountains. Do you ever think about what would have happened if the wagon wheel hadn't broken? She asked. If I'd made it to Ashford's ranch, Colton considered. I think you would have worked there a year, maybe two. You would have been lonely. Eventually, you would have left. And you? I would have stayed up here alone until the cold or the silence finally finished what the war started. She took his hand. We saved each other. No, he said, turning to face her. You saved me. I just opened the door. She smiled. You did more than that. He kissed her forehead. So did you. Inside, the fire burned warm. Outside, the Montana nights stretched vast and wild. And in a small cabin on a ridge where no one had any business surviving, let alone thriving, a family built from a wrong turn and a desperate knock had become the most right thing either of them had ever known. The blizzard that had nearly killed Nora Brennan had, in the end, given her everything. And the cowboy who had opened the wrong door had found, at last, what he'd been searching for all along. Home.